The current Parliament is now 2 years into its 5-year term of office. From time to time, we invite one of the members of the Keys or Council to join us for a conversation to hear their personal view on the work so far, the day-to-day demands, the current and future priorities, and what's yet to be done. Social media making politics more accessible, concerns over the Lizère road safety, the problems with the European General Data Protection Regulations, which were recently taken into Manx law. Is the island being used as a political football? They're all recent examples of the many topics of concern raised by today's studio guest, and the list of issues he raises in Tynwald is growing monthly. An accountant by profession, he entered Manx political life in 2012 when he became a member of the Ramsey Town Commissioners and was elected in 2016 to represent Ramsey in the Keys, and he's one of the 2 Liberal Vannin Party members in Tynwald. We welcome today MHK Lawrie Hooper. Thank you for joining us, Lawrie.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
Yeah. Well, there we are then, Lawrie. 2 years into the job. I bet it seems a lot longer.
It feels like a lot longer, yeah. Someone was talking to me the other day about it, and they asked me how I was getting on and how I've been feeling, and I said, well, I've only been here, I think it was a year and a half at that point, and they said, a year and a half? No, you were definitely in the last house, weren't you? No, I definitely wasn't.
Well, that also shows they forget the others, doesn't it? One said to me, there's nothing so stale as yesterday's politician. You tend to get forgotten sometimes. Some members tend to get forgotten when they're in there, in some cases, but it depends on what you do, I suppose.
I think so, yeah.
Yes. Is it what you expected? I mean, you went set out effectively for a job. A funny way to get a job, but that's what you did. You set out.
I think I've described it as the hardest job interview I've ever gone through. It is an unusual job, definite. No, pretty much what I was anticipating. I think the 4 years on the commission really helped build a better understanding of Manx politics and how things work, behind the scenes, how things work on the public eye as well. So yeah, I think I knew what I was getting into, and I don't think I've been overly surprised as to actually how it's all panned out.
Right, good. Well, priorities at election time now. Election priorities, election manifestos, election campaigns are very often very different to the reality of the job. Has much changed since you wrote your manifesto?
That's a good question, actually. I suppose in short, I'd say, I don't want to say no, but no, really. I think the priorities that we had 2 years ago are still there, primarily because they're quite big issues that are going to take a while to tackle in a lot of cases. Election manifestos are quite interesting. For me, I tried to steer away from the traditional let's make a lot of big promises and wild promises for people, and just tried to set out an overview of the kind of person that I was and the kind of views that I hold, to try and give people a picture of who I was. I thought that would be a lot more beneficial to people than making a lot of point-in-time promises that would straight away become irrelevant the moment you get elected, or actually wouldn't be deliverable in a lot of cases. So I thought it's better to be honest with people and just say, well, the best I'm going to do, or all I can really promise is I'll try and do my best for you, and these are the kind of views that I hold, the kind of political position I have on a few big issues, so you can see where I lean. Because the other problem with manifestos, of course, is you can't predict the future, so you can't write in there how you're going to deal with every issue that comes along. So it's very difficult to try and frame that picture of yourself, saying, well, this is how I would vote on this issue, which hasn't actually arisen yet, but it might come up in the next 5 years.
Shifting sands.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's often said that election manifestos in the Isle of Man are not, as opposed to other countries where there's a formal party structure that is in operation. In the Isle of Man, is more an assessment of whether the individual has the capabilities to deal what is thrown at him than actually what he says he thinks he's going to do.
I think that's probably quite fair. I think the manifesto is only one part, I think, of the campaigning process. I think probably the most important part is actually getting out there and meeting people, talking to them on the doorstep, having the public meetings, doing the hustings. That's I think a lot more valuable for a lot of people than the piece of paper that comes through the door. So I think, it's one aspect, I think.
Now, you're one now of 2 Liberal Vannin Party members. Now, we had 3 at the start, now in the House, now 2. With leaving aside what the Liberal Vannin Party stands for and does, how do you think you can make an impact? You can't be much of an opposition with 2 people, can you? Or do you not see that your role?
I think partly it's not the role of any particular party to be the formal opposition. The Isle of Man political structure doesn't quite work like that. It's not a us and them kind of environment, so it's difficult to try and to frame that position of, well, we are the opposition. I mean, a good example of why that isn't quite true is that I sit in 2 government departments. I sit in education and in enterprise, so it'd be difficult for me to be part of a formal opposition if I'm also trying to make change from the inside. I think, from my perspective at least, the advantages to having kind of party colleagues is that you always know you've got someone there who's got your back on the issue. So if you're bringing questions forward, you know you've got someone who's thinking similar things to you, that's on the same kind of page, same wavelength. If you're bringing emotions forward, you know you've got someone there who's going to be willing to stand up and second you or support you. So it's a lot more than just a pure numbers game, I think. And I think it also does make people think twice sometimes, because with every other MHK that's in there, they're all independent, so they've got to try and convince everybody that they're on the right track, that they're trying to do the right thing. Whereas when you're within a party structure like I am, you've got that backup that, you know, it's not just you that's going out there trying to convince other people. You know, you've got that.
You mean other people in the House?
In the House, yes, yeah.
Well, with just one other, of course, you've still got the rest of them to convince.
Yes, that is true, but it gives you a core to work from, I think.
Yeah, well, yes, but you've got 3 years to go. Now, we hear a lot about government and programme plans for government for the next 3 years. Do you have a personal target, or does the party have a personal target for those next 3 years?
I think my personal target really for the next 3 years is trying to make sure that we achieve the things that we set out to achieve to start with. So the first one of those has got to be, you know, they keep saying balancing the budget, but I think if we haven't managed to do that, if we haven't managed to address that by the end of the 5 years, I think we won't have done a particularly good job. I think if we haven't at least made significant progress towards addressing things like the pension legacy deficit that we've got, then I think we won't have done a good job. So there are a few big ticket items that I think it's incumbent on us to try and address by the end of this Parliament. Otherwise it's going to be difficult to stand up and say, you know what, we had a very successful 5 years if you haven't managed to solve some of these big problems that we all knew about at election time. Everyone was campaigning on these issues 2 years ago.
Particularly public service pensions.
Exactly. So if you're campaigning on an issue at election time, and then 5 years later you go back out to campaign again and you're still saying, you know, that issue I talked to you about 5 years ago, we still haven't fixed that. You know, I think that's a bit that isn't really a good sign of progress, is it?
But you've got a problem there that one has to ask, is it fixable?
Yeah, I have the view that actually no problem is insurmountable. Sometimes you might need to be thinking outside the box or trying something that hasn't been tried elsewhere, which has been my position on the public sector pensions for quite a while. I wrote a piece on my website about it just before the election, talking about the use of sort of mirror funds or those kind of unusual approaches to solving problems. And I think that's the kind of thing we've got to be thinking about now, is how do you... we know that all the traditional methods for solving these problems either haven't worked or look like they might work, but they're going to be very expensive, or they're going to be very difficult for us to implement. So actually, let's start thinking outside the box a little bit.
Very difficult within the system, the structure that we have of government, which is very similar in many ways to the philosophy of structure of the UK and other Southern Ireland and other people. It's very difficult, isn't it, to break that mould, because I've heard it said very recently, when something has been suggested, oh, that's not the way we do things.
Yeah, there is a lot of that institutional kind of inertia, I suppose, is the way to describe it. You are trying to steer an oil tanker in some respects, and it's much harder to do that from where I am on the backbenches than it is, I suppose, if you're sitting within the Council of Ministers. So in some ways we are reliant on the Council of Ministers being willing to maybe take some risk and try something that's maybe a little bit outside their comfort zone, a little bit different to what's been tried in the past. So yeah, it's not easy. I think one of the things I was saying when I was knocking on doors was you've got to have a bit of a thick skull to get into Manx politics, because you are banging your head against a wall a lot, and you've got to be willing to do that. And you know, as long as you're persistent and you're willing to keep trying, eventually I think the message will get through, and I think eventually you will be able to kind of steer that super tanker in the direction we need to be going in.
You can't win them all, though, unfortunately. You know?
No, you can't. That's very true.
Yeah. Now, there's two of you. Well, there's two. I'll rephrase that. I said the target for the next 3 years. But traditionally, you've only got two, because the third year tends to people start to protect their interests and to start to campaign.
Yeah,
so is that public service pension the top of your list of balancing the books, or are there other priorities?
I think there are a lot of things we need to get right. I mean, the obvious one I think that's coming up next that we're going to be seeing entering into the branches very soon is going to be our Brexit EU withdrawal bill. How do we deal with the legal side and the legislative side of Brexit? That's going to be a big challenge, I think, for us to get right. So there are these hurdles. It's not just waiting for the one big thing to hit at the end of the process. We've got these things coming up all the time. We dealt with beneficial ownership earlier in the year. We're now dealing with EU listing and substance concerns. Everything seems to be hitting us all at the same time. So there's a lot of things that need to be done, that need to be fixed, that need to be addressed, and they're not all easy fixes, unfortunately.
But a lot of these things that are being fixed, putting it in inverted commas, are not far origination, are they? They're pressures from without.
Yeah, that's very true. I think fixed might be the wrong word. I think addressed might be a better word, because some of these problems, you know, they're being imposed on us, or requirements imposed on us by elsewhere, and so all we can really do is comply to some extent. You know, our future's taken out of our hands. When you're talking about how we interact with the UK, how we interact with the EU, we don't have a great deal of influence there. You know, we've got a little bit, and I think we're trying to use that influence for the right purposes. But yeah, if somebody tells us you must have this in place by a certain date, what else can we do?
Depends who tells you.
Yeah.
The programme for government is something which has been trumpeted a great deal of late, from the start of its presentation. And we hear that it's on target, we hear that there's things still to do, and so on. But you've gone on record saying that the programme doesn't measure the right things in some instances.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's one of the reasons I'm quite glad that it's this living document, and so that what it's measuring can be changed. And I'll give you an example of that. Is within Enterprise, we've recently launched the new agency structure. It's been quite widely publicised, but Enterprise already has a lot of targets and things within the programme for government. But now actually we're looking at the agencies to say, well, are these the right things to be measuring? You know, in tourism, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring the right things within the finance sector? And that's a question that's going to be asked of the agencies, and hopefully they'll come back and say either yes, these are the right things, or no, they're not. Let's change them and get some more appropriate measures in place. So yeah, at the moment, I think some of the stuff in the programme for government possibly isn't measuring the right things, and I've said that before. But I'm hoping that we are actually starting to get there now through this kind of iterative, evolving process to make sure we are looking at the right numbers. Because part of the problem with things is if you're measuring it, then there's that extra incentive to make sure that you're addressing it. Whereas if you're not looking at some of the numbers, if you're not measuring it, it's quite easy to just push it to one side and pretend there's no issue.
Well, you've got on the team now, you've brought in outsiders on each of these, effectively outsiders to government on all of these teams. And for me, it's deja vu. It's like turning the clock back, because in the board structure days, so many of the boards of Tynwald had non-Tynwald members on board, people with specific expertise they brought to it, and it worked.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thinking behind this new agency model, is that if you've got people who are experts in their particular field that are day-to-day working and living in a particular environment, then why wouldn't you reach out and use their expertise and take their advice on things? So, you know, it's a new approach for this administration and for the ministerial system, I suppose, because it is quite new for that. So far, I think it's working quite well. Quite early stages, obviously, but I'm quite optimistic.
Quite a way to go in this instance.
Yes.
But how much freedom do the people coming in have, or are they locked into the system, the board system, or are they able to develop their own methods of doing things?
Well, the whole reason for doing it this way is precisely to give them their own remit and to let them develop their own ways of doing things. So as far as it goes to restrictions, there aren't really any. It's just a case of you guys go out there and think about what you think is best, and we'll see what we can do.
Now, you've turned your mind in the last 2 years to a whole catalogue of subjects. Are these subjects things that are of interest to you? Are those, I'll go over a couple of them with you in a minute, but are they points of view, are they issues that are brought to you by your constituents?
It's a mixture. So some things are issues that have been raised by constituents or by concerned residents who may not be constituents. Some things are things that are necessary, so a piece of legislation is put in front of you. Well, that's part of the job, is to make sure you take an interest in everything that's put in front of you, that you're passing laws over. So some of it is constituent issues, some of it's things I've got a personal interest in, some of it is things, like say, that are routine government business that's coming out, and it's part of the job.
I noticed one of them was in July this year, was the issue of decriminalisation or legalisation of cannabis.
Yeah.
Now, this has been on the go for some time. We've had programmes here about it 3 or 4 times over the years.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to have moved one way or the other. It's still in the same position. I mean, what's your view on that?
I think it's been tricky over the years, because the Isle of Man doesn't want to be too out of step with the UK, and so the UK has looked at this issue over and over again and keeps coming to the same conclusion. They don't want to change anything. But I think recently we've seen in the UK them look at decriminalising medical use for medicinal products, and that's a step for them. So now maybe the Isle of Man will follow suit. I'd like to see the Isle of Man take the lead on this within the United Kingdom kind of umbrella. You've seen other jurisdictions around the world that have gone the full legalisation route, and I think for me that would be my preferred option, to say, actually, let's talk about setting up a regulated legal market for this, because decriminalising end use doesn't necessarily solve any of the problems. Just because you're saying the end user isn't going to be prosecuted, well, that end user is still purchasing an illegal drug from people who are criminals, who are purchasing it from other people who are criminals, who are growing it illegally, and so you end up actually still supporting that whole chain of illegal activity, even though you're not prosecuting the end user. the market is still there, the illegal activity is still going on. Whereas if you take a step back and say, well, let's regulate it like we regulate most drugs. Let's be honest, most medicinal drugs.
Tobacco?
Exactly, tobacco, alcohol. We regulate them in a certain way and say, well, let's have a legal market. Let's let people have a license to use it. Let's tax it. Let's sell it legally. There are ways and means of doing it. The big challenge then, of course, becomes how do you stop people exporting it to places where it isn't legal? How do you stop them taking it on the boat? Do we want sort of cannabis tourism like they have in places like Amsterdam? It's another question to be answered. So, but yeah, personally, I'm very open to this idea of let's take a sensible, realistic look at it rather than just crawling along following the UK, which I'm not convinced is necessarily the right approach.
I was going to ask you about that when you referred to being in line with the UK. But the Isle of Man doesn't have to be in line with the UK.
No, that's true. There's nothing that requires us to be. I think it just becomes. I think there's a worry that it could be quite difficult if we have to start putting, say, if we have to put a customs check in place, for example. We don't have that at the moment. So if we had to put customs in place to stop sort of illegal export of these kind of products, that would be an extra expense. But from my perspective, Brexit means we're probably going to have to do that anyway. We may have to have some kind of customs. We had in front of the Constitutional Affairs Committee, we were talking to the customs collector, and he was saying that they're going to need extra resources as part of Brexit anyway, probably staff on the doors or staff to deal with customs declarations. So if we're going through this process,
is this anyway, if there's a no deal?
I think anywhere, whatever happens, because whatever happens, there is going to be a new border between us and the Republic of Ireland, for example, as an EU country. So there is going to need to be some change anyway. So if we're going through this process,
it's a common travel area.
I suspect so. Yeah, I suspect from a customs perspective there will have to be something in place. What that might look like, I think we've no idea at this point.
Well, the whole thing with Brexit, nobody has an idea exactly what it's going to be at this point, do
yes,
they?
that is the problem.
But the date's getting nearer.
Yeah, we're very fast approaching the March deadline, I think. So, and this is what I mentioned earlier with we're having an EU withdrawal bill being put in front of us very shortly. It's been consulted on, so they're probably working on the consultation responses at the moment, and that's going to be entered into the branches. That's going to be quite important for us because it's going to set out the framework as to how we deal with Brexit legislation, how we deal with keeping the status quo or making changes where we need to make changes. It's going to be quite an important piece of law that comes through.
When you talk about this, and I'll mention another European thing in a moment, the thing that concerns me is they're exceedingly complex and complicated. And it is the responsibility of the members of the House of Key, Tynwald indeed, to vote yea or nay in respect to whatever comes out, legislation or orders that come out of this. My concern has always been that it's so complex and so complicated that the members of the House, with the best will in the world, don't always know what they're voting on.
I suppose that is probably a valid concern. Legislation is more and more complex. I mean, there's some stuff coming through at the moment that is very complex, it's very technical. And I think all you can do really as a member of the House is to make sure that you read it to start with, and then you go and speak to the departments, the people that are writing it, that are experts in the field, talk to them about what things mean if you don't understand them, how it's going through. But it is a lot of work for any individual member to go through and do some of this, because everyone's doing it themselves. So you've got 24 people, half of them in government, half not, and you're trying to get an understanding of some of these quite complex issues, which are quite varied. So it's not like you can spend a solid week working on a single piece of legislation, because you might have a few different pieces coming through at the same time, all on completely different topics. And on top of that, you've got constituent work, you've got government work, everything that's going on. So it is quite difficult to try and get yourself in that mental space to say this is a very technical, very complex piece of law. Let's sit down and try and wrap my head around it and see what's going on, what's good about it, what's bad about it, what works, what doesn't. It is a complex process.
Well, you seem to do that with GDPR, the General Data Protection regulations. I looked at and read, indeed, your contribution to the Tynwald debate on it, and it came very clear to me that you must have spent an enormous amount of time on it.
Yeah, I had, but like I said, I spend a similar amount of time on everything that comes through, because it is a core part of the job. It is very time consuming, but it's got a piece of work that I quite enjoy. Actually, I quite enjoy going through the legislative side of things, going through the law and talking to people and trying to get a wider understanding of what it is that we're actually passing. But yeah, that particular piece of legislation, again, very technical, very complex. I spent a lot of time talking to people who with a much deeper understanding of it than I have, to try and get different views, different perspectives on what works, what's good about it, what's bad about it, what might cause issues. And again, most of the issues I raised, I think, were policy disagreements, were about the approach, because obviously the way they've drafted the bill allows certain things to happen in a certain way. and I was looking at it thinking there's a better way of doing this. The way they do it in Jersey, for example, they've got a different approach.
But they took 2 years to do it, and we took about 2 months.
That again is a criticism. I think Bill Shimmons, MHK, referred to it as a little bit lastminute.com, and I'd agree with that comment, that it did feel a little bit rushed. But then again, this is a problem we face, I think, quite regularly on the Isle of Man. Is someone gives us a piece of work from outside that says you must comply. Either we set our own deadlines or they set a deadline, and actually then you're trying to cram everything in and you get something placed in front of you, and the message from government is you have to approve this, because if you don't, the world is going to end. And I think then there's that element of panic. Oh no, we've got to approve this. But actually, I think it's incumbent on us to take a step back and look at these things that are coming through and ask the question, okay, fine, you've given us a deadline. Is this right for us? Because if it's not right for us, it doesn't matter who's given you a deadline, who's told you when it's got to be in place. If it's not right, you shouldn't be putting it through.
I, during my life, have had 1 or 2 friends, one in particular who knew a great deal about international law. And he could never understand, these are his words, not mine, why the Isle of Man never adopted the provision of le droit administratif, which is a French, very clearly laid down, if you can get it, you can go look at it, policy document, which is totally internationally accepted, which says, I'm aware of what our international obligations are, but due to some local difficulties, I cannot implement them now, and as soon as possible, I will.
I think actually in some instances the Isle of Man's position has been pretty much that. They've said we're aware what our obligations are and we'll do our absolute best to bring these in on time. And I think actually if we've made that commitment, we've said we are going to comply but we need a bit more time to comply, I don't really anticipate our international partners having a big issue with that. You know, as long as you're not saying...
As long as you do it.
Exactly, as long as you're not saying, well, I'll do it in 10 years. You know, as long as you're saying, well, actually I need an extra couple of months. You know, I can't imagine...
The French are very clever at it. They drag it out to ages till somebody prods them again.
Exactly. And I think there is a bit of that over cautiousness, I think, about government, where they're saying, well, if we don't comply, we don't know what will happen. And I can understand that position, but I think sometimes you need to take a bit of a stronger line and say, well, that's great, and we are definitely going to comply, but we need to make it appropriate for the island, and it takes a bit longer.
Well, making it appropriate for the island, your words these are, not mine. It's neither plain, simple, and not to all capabilities intelligible.
Yes, if you look on the government's legislation website, that is a very helpful quote that is actually on the front of our own government's legislation website, describing how our laws should be. They should be plain, they should be simple, they should be understandable. And I think the problem when we're doing things like importing EU law word for word, it loses some of that understandability.
Obtuse, difficult to follow, and so unnecessarily complex and bureaucratic was another of your quotes.
Yes, and again, I think that I'd stand by that comment. It is quite, that's how I felt about it when going through it anyway. And, you know, I had a lot of time invested in going through it, trying to understand it, and I felt it was like that. So I have no idea how someone feels who hasn't spent that amount of time going through it in detail to find out what the rules and requirements and regulations are. So, yeah, let's stand by that comment.
Fails at the most basic requirements, yet you voted for it.
I think when we ended up was, like I said, you're being pressured into, you have these international obligations, and I think I pushed it as far as I felt was safe to push it. You know, with Legislative Council rejecting the original version, pushed it back by a month. Unfortunately, I didn't get the support of the House of Keys to make the government go away and rethink their approach, which meant really where we were at is it's been pushed back a month right up to the recess. If it had got pushed back any further, we would have had another 3 or 4 month delay. And personally, I felt that wasn't what I was about. I wasn't trying to delay unnecessarily. I was trying to make government take a step back and revisit its approach. And like I said, I got the support from Legislative Council to do that, but unfortunately I didn't really convince members of the House of Keys that was necessary. And the government didn't take the opportunity of that 1 month delay, which was there anyway because it had happened, didn't take the opportunity to go away and have a rethink. They just came back with exactly the same document, and at that point I thought, yeah, I don't really want to endanger the Isle of Man's international status. So I had no choice really other than to vote for it.
Well, of course, it's not the first time that the House of Keys and Tynwald has been reconvened during the recess for an urgent matter. That's
true. That would always have been possible. I'm not sure whether the government would have gone that far, but I didn't really feel like pushing them to the test, if I was going to be perfectly honest.
Now, you've been recently talking about social media, and you said, I found this quite interesting, you said it's making politics more accessible. How's it doing that?
Well, it just gives people another avenue to talk to their politicians. I mean, I get stopped in the street, I talk to people on the telephone, but actually quite often you get messages from people on Facebook or on Twitter, you know, just saying, help, I've got an issue, I've come across this. It just gives you that extra medium. And the great thing about social media is it lets you have a dialogue. So it's a bit like having a conversation in a pub that anyone can drop in and out of whenever they want to. So that's why I think things like Facebook and Twitter really do increase that awareness and that accessibility. It means I'm available to people. Anyone that wants to send a message, anybody that wants to start a public conversation about anything, they can do that quite easily without having to organise a public meeting or drag me down to a public event. So I think it does have that effect of making politicians at least more accessible.
But I can understand making contact with you, but they can pick up the phone and do that.
They can, yeah.
What about what does it do? Does it create? Do you think it creates a public debate, a sensible public debate?
I think it can do. I think it creates a forum in which you can have a sensible public debate, and I've experienced both extremes myself, where you have some very useful, very informative, very sensible public debates. Some of them about just sharing information with people and then explaining some of that information when it wasn't quite fully understood or when people had questions about it. I had very few useful policy debates as well, where we've talked about some things that are happening, that are going on, and people have fed back and said, well, actually, I don't think that might work, or have you considered this? It's been quite useful. But then on the other extreme, I've also had the kind of debates that really have descended into madness, where you're talking to people that may be behind anonymous accounts, or people that get quite aggressive for no real reason, and then that isn't quite as helpful or as useful.
Well, it does allow a whole series of things to happen, doesn't it? Particularly unaccountability.
That's a concern that's quite often levelled at social media, actually, is people aren't accountable for their words and their actions. Not true. You are still accountable for things you say.
Well, if you know who you are, they are.
Yeah, and with some of these sites, it's not too difficult to find out who people are, especially on a small community like the Isle of Man. It often comes out, and you know who is really behind some of these accounts. But that's a criticism which sometimes is fairly levelled at social media, but sometimes is unfairly used, I think, to try and detract from the value that social media can have. But from my perspective, I think there's a bit of a responsibility on both sides. So there's a responsibility on politicians to stop yelling, it's all fake news, it's all rubbish. And equally, I think there's a responsibility on users.
Some of it must be fake when you look at some of the things that...
Some of it is. Some of it is, and that's what I was just about to say. Some of the responsibility lies on the users of social media to make sure that they're not using anonymous accounts to troll people, to hurl abuse, to repeat fake news. It's very useful as a platform, and I think it does.
The Man Line, which has been a programme on this station since the 1970s, has changed to an extent, because although we still do get people using it, not to the same extent. One of the reasons used to be lots of telephone calls. These days, not so many telephone calls, and a lot of that's got to do with the people don't on social media, they don't necessarily have to justify what they're saying. If you come on a phone-in programme, somebody like me is going to say to them, where do you get that from?
That's true. It is harder to challenge, I think, some of the assertions and statements that are put out on social media, but just to flip that around a little bit, some people don't feel comfortable expressing their own opinion. Say they might be, I don't know, a doctor working at Noble's trying to raise a concern about something that's going on. They might not want their own name and voice attached to that, so then they might contact you through social media, which is a bit more anonymous. They might feel a bit more protected. So there are pros and cons, I think. So it comes back to being responsible, is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the use of Twitter by the American president, I mean, there's an example of perhaps it gets to a lot of people, but how safe is it all?
And like I said, it comes back to responsible use on both parties, really. It's not just on the public, but actually on politicians as well. Now,
talking about campaigning, election campaigning. Now, the traditional system is still generally in operation. We have people who produce manifestos. You go around and knock on the door and press the flesh and talk to as many people as you possibly can. Yet at the last election, I was surprised to meet up with and talk to many young people, as we were doing the election programs, who said that they didn't really want a manifesto. They just wanted a few lines on Facebook. Now, I said to them, how are you going to get the depth of the candidate there? How are you going to explore the issues? Well, I don't really. It was a fleetingness. There was something impermanent about it, no substance to it. I found that worrying.
Right. I mean, my experience was I did a combination of things. I met people face to face. I put out a manifesto. I also put out a very short sort of bullet point newsletter, for want of a better word, which kind of summarised my manifesto in a few key points. And I took the same approach with social media as well, to try and do a mix of long blog posts explaining policy and ideas on some areas, and also much shorter, kind of more concise bits of information. So I think it's about trying to tailor the message you're trying to send to the audience, so that some people are going to want a full manifesto. I mean, an example would be when you're talking to people on the doorstep. Some people just want a 30-second shake of the hand, good to meet you, thanks for coming around. Other people, they want to spend an hour with you talking about all sorts of things. So it's the same thing, I think. I think we're talking about the same thing. It's just that's the old style way of doing it, is door-to-door, face-to-face, and actually what you're talking about is maybe a slightly more digital approach, but you have the same effect. Some people want the full 3,000-word policy document, and some people just want a few bullet points.
But am I showing my age then when I say that I don't think you can beat personal contact?
I think most people feel the same way, actually. I mean, talking about canvassing the recent by-election we had in Ramsey for Ramsey commissioners, I think it was a 16 or 18% turnout, which is quite low. But when I was talking to people about, well, did you vote, or why didn't you vote? And people were saying, well, I didn't know who the candidates were. They didn't come knocking on the door. I didn't meet anyone. And you think, well, I actually accept that. They had a very short time scale to do it, so I actually don't think they'd have been able to get around everyone, even if they took 2 weeks off work and tried their best. But it was a concern that came out from a number of people saying, well, I didn't meet them. So if I didn't meet them, how could I vote for them? And actually, personally, I feel that's a little bit old-fashioned, because if you've read their manifesto, read their document, what does meeting them face-to-face give you?
It gives you a feel of the individual.
It does, and that I think is the bit that people like, is actually they want to look you in the eye and, are you being honest, are you being genuine about this? So I really understand that about Max politics, and it's actually one of the big advantages, I think, of living on a small island with our reasonably small constituencies, is you do get to meet your representatives, and you can be in regular contact with them. It's not like in the UK where your MP might represent 80,000 people. It's a much smaller community.
You talked about using Facebook or whatever, the social media. I'm going back 40 years now, but my wife used to say she'd be in ShopRite doing the groceries, and somebody would pin her to one of the walls and say, "Will you tell your husband?" So do you get a lot of stopping in the street contact even today?
Yeah, you still do, actually. Try to have conversations in ShopRite car park. There was, at one point, I think myself and Dr. Anderson kept bumping into each other in ShopRite car park, and we'd obviously just say hi and have a quick chat. And then people would start approaching you, and you felt like you're having a surgery.
Public meeting.
In a public meeting in the car park. So yeah, it does happen quite regularly.